The haunting of Willow Creek Manor, a house with a dark past. The road twisted through the dense forest, shrouded in mist, as Kip and his wife Laura drove towards their new homia, grand yet eerie Victorian mansion in upstate New York. Willow Creek Manor, as the locals called it, had stood abandoned for years, a relic of forgotten times. "This place gives me the chills," Laura muttered, gripping her jacket tighter. Kip chuckled nervously. "It's just an old house, nothing more." But deep down, he wasn't so sure. A visitor in the night. The first night in the house was quiet, save for the occasional creak of the wooden floors and the whispering wind outside. Wanting company, Laura invited her sister, Jane, and her newborn baby to spend a few days with them. That night, the house stirred. At around 3 a.m., Laura woke up to faint murmuring coming from the downstairs bedroom where Jane and the baby slept. Half asleep, she dismissed it as a dream until she heard Jane's voice, urgent and hushed. The next morning over breakfast, Laura asked, "Jane, were you talking to someone last night?" Jane went pale. "I woke up and saw an old woman standing over the baby's crib. I told her to leave and she did." Silence fell over the room. Kip set down his coffee, his hands trembling slightly. Unexplained phenomena begin. Over the next few days, the house's presence became undeniable. Lamps flickered and moved positions overnight. Shadows darted across the halls, seen only from the corner of the eye. The air always felt heavy, as though someone was watching. One afternoon, Laura was tending to her garden when the fire alarm inside went off. She rushed inside, following the shrill beeping to the downstairs bedroom. The second she opened the door, a thick white fog engulfed her. For a moment, everything blurred. Shapes moved within the fog, figures too distorted to be human. Then, as suddenly as it appeared, the fog vanished. The alarm went silent. Shaken, Laura stepped back, gasping for air. A dark history revealed. Determined to uncover the truth, Kip visited a neighbor, Mrs. Holloway, a woman in her 70s who had lived in the area her whole life. "You bought that house?" she asked, eyes widening. "No one's lived there for years. Not since Eleanor." Kip leaned in. "Who was Eleanor?" Mrs. Holloway hesitated, then sighed. "Eleanor Morgan. She lived there alone for decades. One night a fire broke out. She never made it out. Some say her spirit never left. The entity grows stronger." Laura Laura dreamed of a woman in a charred black dress standing at the foot of her bed. Her lips moved, whispering words Laura couldn't understand. She woke up drenched in sweat, Kip shaking her awake. "You were screaming," he said. The room was ice cold. Over the following weeks, the manifestations intensified. The baby's crib would rock on its own. Footsteps echoed through empty hallways. The whispering became clearer, words laced with sorrow and warning. "Get out before it's too late." One stormy night, Kip and Laura heard a blood-curdling scream echo through the house. Rushing downstairs, they found Jane standing in the hallway, frozen in terror. "She's here," she whispered. The temperature dropped sharply. The lights flickered violently, and then the old woman appeared at the end of the hallway. Her face was ashen, her eyes hollow pits of darkness. She raised a hand, and every door in the house slammed shut simultaneously. Kip grabbed Laura and Jane. "We're leaving now." But as they reached the front door, the old woman stood blocking their path. The house trembled, wind howling through the corridors. With a desperate lunge, Kip yanked the door open, and they tumbled outside into the pouring rain. Behind them, the house loomed, its windows glowing with an eerie red light. Then, silent. The house returned to darkness. Aftermath. The house that wouldn't let go. The next morning, Kip and Laura packed their belongings and never looked back. Weeks later, they learned that Willow Creek Manor had burned down mysteriously exactly 20 years to the day of Eleanor Morgan's death. Had Eleanor been trying to warn them? Or was she the reason the house had taken on a life of its own? No one would ever know. But one thing was certain. Some places never forget their past, and some spirits never leave. The Phantom Ambulance, a chilling tale of the unknown. It's late at night. The wind howls through the empty roads, and the moon barely peeks through thick clouds, casting an eerie glow. The night is unusually quiet, too quiet for comfort. Robert, a seasoned paramedic, sits nervously in the passenger seat, his partner gripping the wheel with determination. They've just received a call. A woman suffering from chest pains, a life or death emergency, and they need to get there fast. But what happens next will make them question everything they thought they knew about the world. Because sometimes, the most terrifying things aren't the ones you see, but the ones that lurk in the darkness. The call A routine night shift turns into a nightmare. It was supposed to be like any other night. Robert and his partner, Mark, were used to the routine of late-night emergency calls in the small rural town of Texas. It was quiet here, too quiet at times, but that night, the wind felt different, heavier, almost oppressive. It was as if something unseen was watching them, waiting for something to unfold. Their call came through just after midnight, a woman experiencing severe chest pains. It wasn't the first time they had dealt with such emergencies, and they knew the drill well. What they didn't know was that this particular call would change everything. "We're going in code 3. Robert said, flicking on the siren as Mark slammed the ambulance into gear. The emergency lights flashed, cutting through the darkness of the desolate rural roads. Their ambulance, an unremarkable vehicle under normal circumstances, now seemed like a beacon in a world of shadow and silence. Robert peered through the window, watching the trees rush past. The map on his lap barely helped. The roads here were more like dirt paths, and without GPS, they had to rely on the sparse and often confusing mailbox numbers to guide them. They approached the general area the woman lived in, a secluded part of the town where the houses were few and far between. As they neared their destination, the glow of their lights cut through the thick fog that had begun to settle, further obscuring their view. "This is it," Robert said, pointing toward a dimly lit mailbox. They had arrived, or so they thought. What was that sound? But when they pulled up to the address, they quickly realized something was off. It wasn't the house they had been looking for. They had made a mistake, a simple one, but enough to throw them off track. Mark pulled the ambulance into reverse and turned off the siren. The silence that followed felt heavy, as if the darkness itself was watching them. "Let's try again," Mark muttered, not looking at Robert. The two men backed out, their headlights now cutting a narrow path through the foggy abyss, and made their way up the correct driveway. As they stepped out of the vehicle, the night air felt unnaturally still. The only sound was the crunch of gravel beneath their boots. When they arrived at the front door, they were greeted with an all-too-familiar scene. It wasn't the woman's first time experiencing a heart attack. They had been here before for her husband, who had died a month earlier from a cardiac arrest. In typical black humor fashion, Robert recalls, "We joked that it was probably her turn now, and that she would join her husband soon." But even as they joked, something didn't sit right with Robert. It was too quiet, too still. And there was something strange about the air, like a presence lingering just beyond the edge of their senses. But they had a job to do, and they did it. The woman was stable, and although she seemed rattled, there were no signs of a heart attack. Relief washed over Robert for a moment. "Mark," Robert said, "go grab the stretcher. We'll take her to the hospital for further evaluation." Mark nodded and walked back toward the ambulance. As Robert began to prepare the woman for transport, he noticed something strange, a sudden flickering of lights. It wasn't just the typical flicker of the ambulance lights either. It was as if every single light in the ambulance had turned on, all at once. The phantom lights. When Mark returned, he was visibly shaken. "Did you turn on all the lights?" he asked, his voice tight with confusion. Robert glanced at the ambulance and froze. It was true. Every light in the ambulance, strobe lights, floodlights, and the interior lights were blaring at full power, illuminating the surrounding area like a circus of lights in the dead of night. "We shut them off when we arrived," Robert said, his voice dropping. The eerie sensation in the air intensified as he spoke. "I swear we did." Mark's face paled. He was as confused as Robert was. Neither of them could explain how all the lights had turned on, or why they hadn't heard anything out of the ordinary. They had been on high alert for a possible emergency, and yet, everything had been silent. "That's not right," Mark said quietly. They loaded the woman into the back of the ambulance, her condition still stable but her eyes wide with a fearful look that Robert couldn't shake. It was as if she knew something they didn't. As the doors slammed shut, Robert noticed something even stranger. There was a sudden gust of wind. Stronger than any before, rattling the vehicle with an unnatural force. But it wasn't just the wind. There was something else, a presence. And then, without explanation, the ambulance's lights turned off. Just as suddenly as they had turned on, the haunting realization. Was it her husband? After delivering the patient to the hospital, Robert and Mark were left alone, standing outside the emergency room. They looked at each other, both with the same question hanging in the air. What had just happened? Why had the lights turned on by themselves? The only explanation they could come up with was one they dared not fully speak aloud. Was it her dead husband's spirit? Had he returned, trying to let his wife know he was still there, still watching over her? Or was there something more sinister at play? Something they could neither understand nor explain. As they drove back to their station, the unsolvable mystery. To this day, Robert and Mark can't explain the lights or the overwhelming sense of something unnatural surrounding them that night. But one thing was clear. They were no longer just paramedics. They had become part of a storied, unexplainable, terrifying story that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. Some things, Robert thought, are better left unsolved. Some mysteries are too dark to unravel, and some presences are better left undisturbed.